Welcome back to Engine Shop Joe, and you've gone through school here, and this is part 5, which is graduation. And I'm going to go through the logs one at a time and let you know what we did to change what we did on the engine to change what. Something that I'm going to tell you that will help you understand why we did some of the things we did is we built this engine from a core that we bought off of, actually, I think, eBay. And it was just a core out of a crane. It was the right engine. When we got it and we took it apart, it had what looked like a new cam sensor and a new crank sensor. It had an ECM on it that was no good. When we pulled the head looked like it was out of a box new. And the pistons, we could read all the numbers on top of the pistons. The bearings looked brand new. And then a lot of the external components had old parts bolted on. But the basic short block of the engine, or actually long block, looked like all new stuff. So we were confused right off the bat. Why would someone sell an engine that had new pistons in it, and they were new, and the rings had no wear, the liners had no wear, and some new sensors in it? Why would they sell it? So at the end of the story, I'll tell you what I think about what I just told you. So let's take a look and go through these logs quick and graduate. Okay, remember I just told you that we got this engine and had two new cam sensor and new crank sensor in it? Well, they were new. They didn't even have dirt or anything on them, but they were both failed. The ECM that came with it was failed. Later on, I'll tell you at the end of this video what we think went on. The core that we got, that we took apart, was pristine. Looked like it was just rebuilt and someone couldn't get it to run and just gave up and bought a Recon engine or another engine and stuck it in. So we changed the crank sensor, and in a little bit you'll see what changes we made with that. But in this log, cranking, our exhaust gas pressure never changed. That meant the turbocharger actuator wasn't really doing anything. And if you look over at turbo measured, it just didn't even want to move. Our battery voltage was 24. It was dropping as we cranked. We thought, well, maybe low voltage, the thing is shutting down. I think that's what was happening. The voltage was dropping low enough that it was not able to actuate things that it needed to actuate. Look at our rail pressure. Now we would crank, key off, key on. Remember this held rail pressure. And the bottom rectangle, we started cranking again, and we didn't build any pressure. We didn't build, and all of a sudden the pressure ran up to 35,000. We stopped cranking, keyed off, wait a minute, talked about it, flipped the key on, started cranking, and the pressure dropped all the way down to 6,000, 3,000, 3,000, 4,000. We could not build any pressure. We're cranking and cranking and cranking, and after 30 seconds, guess what happened? The pressure went right back up to 35,000. That's because we had the fuel pump wire plugged into the fuel actuator and the fuel actuator plugged into the lift pump. So right here, we started cranking this. We cranked it 60 seconds straight. On the left, that yellow square was 30 seconds on a stopwatch. Remember, at 30 seconds, the lift pump circuit turns off. Because we had the lift pump circuit plugged into the fuel actuator, notice we built no rail pressure at all until that line where the pump shut off, and we went right to 25,000. And then after that, it dropped down to 7,000, 6,000. It was following commanded. In this log, we changed our crank sensor, not the cam sensor, just the crank sensor. And we've got low speed governor state now because the ECM knows that the engine is turning. Our engine speed status is degraded. We figured that's because of the cam sensor. In a minute, we're going to try the cam sensor. Our intake manifold pressure is off. We have 14 pounds of intake manifold pressure at key on. Why? Because the barometric air pressure was wrong, and all the sensors that are reading wrong at key on are zeroed by the barometric pressure. And that was in a default state because there was no barometric sensor plugged in. We had to get an extension harness, and we found the port and we plugged it in. And then once our barometric pressure was right, all those other values corrected themselves. Go back to the left and see that we cranked it, and then we stopped cranking. It said engine stop, and I'm bumping the starter. I bump, 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 and all of a sudden it fires on the line where you see 993 RPM. Look over to the right. You see once it starts, it's commanding 18,000 pounds of rail pressure. It has to because it thinks that we have 14 pounds of boost pressure because our barometric air pressure is wrong. We haven't figured that out yet, but we do know that the rail pressure is commanded high because of boost pressure. But look at the rail pressure. It can't build past 11,400. Why is that? That's because when we were cranking it with the actuator plugged into the fuel pump circuit, the rail pressure, once the fuel pump shut down, got so high because the fuel system was in such good shape that the dump opened. And after a while, the dump stuck open. That's why, but we didn't know this, but that's why it couldn't build rail pressure here. It's commanding 18, but it can only build 11, even though at this point we still hadn't fixed that wire problem. So it should have been able to build 35, 40,000, but it couldn't get past 11. I reached down and grabbed the rail dump finally because we were baffled why we couldn't build fuel pressure, and I burned my hand on the rail dump. It was so hot. So that explained that. We had to replace the rail dump at that point. Now in this log, we changed the cam sensor, and now we have backup synchronization. So both sensors are good. The engine's starting. This engine idles at 1,000 RPM. It's industrial, so that's okay. It's running good. We got a new rail dump valve in. Our fuel pump duty cycle is down to normal. Notice the turbo has gone to 88%. Look at our exhaust gas pressure. It's 51. That's good. Everything's looking good, except when we crank the engine, sometimes it doesn't want to start. It'll crank and crank and crank. So I tried cranking it, letting off the starter for a split second and hitting it again. I do that 2 or 3 times like I'm bumping it around, and then it fires. I can't figure out why. And I see engine speed status is degraded. Look over to the right, the rail pressure is great. We got barometric pressure that's correct now, 29.2, perfect. Oil pressure 0 when we start it up. It goes up to 68 like it should at 1,000 RPM. Intake manifold boost is correct. Everything's great except engine speed status is degraded. And we can't get it to just start if we shut it off and crank, 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 even though it should start. So our last log, we're going to figure out why it wouldn't start normally, and we had to keep bumping it around to get it to fire. So now here you see speed status is good. So I'm pulling my hair out trying to figure out why it was degraded, and I go over and I look at another engine that's like this engine, and I'm looking at the crank sensor and I'm looking at the cam sensor, and I noticed that the engine that I'm looking at that we had no trouble with, it's a sister to this engine, it has one hole where the cam sensor goes. And I come back and look at this engine, and I look way up, and there's 2 cam sensor holes. And one's got a plug in it, and the sensor's in the other one. And I asked the guy working, I said, "You put this gear housing on with these 2 cam holes, sensor holes, right?" And he says, "Yeah." And I says, "How did you know which sensor to put the cam sensor in?" And he goes, "Well, if you put it in the one that's closest to the block, the harness is twisted when you plug it in. If you put it in the one it's in, the harness goes right to it naturally. There's no kink in the harness." And I said, take the plug out and put the cam sensor in the other hole so the harness is twisted." He stuck it in there, and the speed status went from degraded to good. And guess what? Every time I shut that engine off and I bumped the starter, it fired right up. So what was happening was the cam sensor was out of time because it was in the wrong pickup hole, and it was a few degrees off because the holes weren't parallel. They were at about a 45-degree angle to one another. And that was made for a different cam gear and different camshaft. Little did we know. So what was happening was the engine saw the cam in the wrong place. When I tried to start it, it wouldn't start. But if I bumped it around so that it was just past one of the tone marks on the cam gear, then when I hit it and it saw the crank, it fired, and it would start and run, but it had degraded speed status because it had to ignore the cam pickup. Even though it saw it, it was synced, it had to ignore it because it was out of time, but the engine was running off the crank sensor, and it just didn't behave correctly. It acted like it was derated. Once we changed the cam sensor and that timing was right, you can see on the left, it would go into high speed governor, all speed governor, low speed governor. It ran like a top, and the problem was fixed. And what a sad tale this was, huh? For the engine shop. But we got her fixed, and it's one we won't soon forget. Thanks for joining me at Engine Shop Joe. If you have any questions, ask them. I'll be glad to answer them. In closing, what we think happened to this engine is we think they rebuilt it and put it in a crane, and we think that lightning struck the crane. That does happen sometimes to machines, and if lightning strikes them, it can do anywhere from no damage to a lot of damage. And this engine had a failed ECM, and all the sensors on it ended up being bad. And the only two that we didn't change when we built it was the crank and the cam, because they looked brand new. And everything else, we just put new sensors in. And that's why we had good readings on other stuff, but we just suspected, we made the huge mistake of assuming that the cam and crank sensors were good, when in fact everything on the thing was damaged. So we think that's why they pulled the engine out and bought another one and stuck it in, because they were tearing their hair out trying to figure out why the engine they just rebuilt wouldn't start, wouldn't run, and they'd already invested a lot of money in it. We don't know that, we just think that. So thanks for joining me on Engine Shop Joe, and I hope this doesn't ever happen to you. See you next time.